So if you've been with us for this series, we've established this idea of two parallel universes.
Right. You had K-12 education on one track and the rest of the data-driven world on another.
And when federal rules finally forced those two worlds to collide, it created this impossible situation for educators.
Exactly. They were suddenly being asked to run systems they had absolutely no training for. We've talked about the big structural pressures, the policy changes.
But they think that still sounds a little abstract to people.
It does, and that's the challenge. So today, we need to move past the policy and get into the concrete evidence, what we actually saw.
Today, we are opening the filing cabinets. We're digging into the boxes of old grant proposals to share the stories we collected over, 3 decades?
30 years, and these are the stories that really prove the depth of the data skills gap. There's just no denying it when you see this stuff.
And I think for you, the listener, you have to understand this. If you work anywhere outside of education, finance, business, logistics, anything, you've seen data tools completely change your job.
Oh, absolutely, over the last 40 years.
You just assume that a basic level of data literacy is universal now, in any professional setting.
You would never imagine, not in your wildest dreams, that an entire sector serving 50 million children just hadn't evolved in that same way.
And that's what we're setting up here. These are the tangible, sometimes shocking examples that made our own staff turn to us and say, I never would have believed this if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes.
And it's so important to say, this wasn't malicious. These weren't bad people.
No.
These were forced innovations, people trying to help students, but they were working in the dark without the tools or the skills.
So our mission today is to show you what working in the dark really looks like. Let's unpack this.
So the pattern became clear almost immediately, and it was consistent everywhere, across districts, across states.
And what was that pattern?
Well, the grants would require programs to serve a very specific data-defined group of students. A reading grant, for instance, had to serve kids scoring below grade level.
Okay.
A math grant was for tutoring students in, say, the bottom academic quartile.
Seems simple enough, right?
Yeah.
Find the kids who need the help, give them the help, and see if it worked.
That was the idea. That was the intent.
Yeah.
But when we'd show up to evaluate these programs, we'd ask the basic question, who are you actually serving?
And the answer was?
The students enrolled were almost universally not the target population. Grants meant for the most struggling learners were filled with students who were already at or even above grade level.
Okay, hold on. If the federal rules say students below grade level and you're serving kids who are already doing fine, how did they explain that? Did they think no one would check?
See, that's the thing. They weren't trying to cover anything up. It wasn't about rationalizing fraud.
Then what was it?
It was the completely predictable outcome when the staff literally could not access the data they needed. They couldn't pull a list of students scoring below grade level.
Then they couldn't run the report.
Couldn't do it. So they fell back on what they could do. They used proxies, teacher recommendations, a parent asking for their kid to be included, or sometimes just whoever showed up for the new program.
And without that list, they were flying blind. They couldn't even see the mistake they were making.
Exactly. And that's when our job turned into this data archaeology project.
The great scavenger hunt.
It really was. We were hunting for data that was buried, siloed. We'd often get pointed to a wall of filing cabinets, with a paper folder for every single student.
Wow.
And when we finally got electronic test scores, they were often just raw scale scores. You'd see a student scored 342.
Which means what?
Nothing. On its own, that number is completely meaningless.
So you didn't just need the score, you needed the key, the translator.
Precisely. We called it the decoder ring. The cut score tables. These tables are what translated that raw score into a proficiency level, basic, proficient, advanced, which is what the grant actually cared about.
And I imagine that decoder ring wasn't simple.
Oh, the complexity was staggering. The cut scores changed by grade, by subject, and often by the year the test was given. A 342 in 5th grade math was totally different from a 342 in 6th grade reading.
So your team had to become experts at this scavenger hunt because the programs themselves couldn't do it.
It was a core part of the job.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because you saw all these behaviors, the mismatched students, the workarounds, and you realized they weren't irrational.
No, not from their point of view. They were logical, completely logical once you understood the underlying assumptions people were operating from.
And that realization is what led you to develop the 9 dimensions framework.
Yes. The framework explains almost everything we saw. Once you know what a person fundamentally believes about knowledge and data, their behavior makes perfect sense.
So their perspective was just based on uh, flawed assumptions about what was even possible.
Fundamentally flawed assumptions, yes.
Okay, so let's connect this right back to the pattern we just talked about. The inability to pull a list of struggling students, that's dimension A.
Dimension A, knowing what can be known. If you're in what we call state 4 for that dimension, you believe that critical data cannot be known.
You just assume it doesn't exist or you can't get it.
Exactly. It's impossible to retrieve. It's too complicated. So if you believe it can't be known, you don't even ask for it. You just work around it.
Which is why they went straight to proxies.
To them, a list of all students below grade level in algebra might as well have been the blueprints for a mission to Mars.
And this is tied to the technology piece, isn't it? Dimension I.
Dimension I, knowing how technology works. This often drives Dimension A. Most staff were in state 3. They use computers for consumption. Social media, Netflix, email.
But not for investigation. Not for asking questions of the data.
Right. They couldn't imagine what a simple sort or filter in a spreadsheet could do, let alone a real student information system. So the whole process of generating a report was just...
magic.
It was magic.
Which, of course, leads directly to Dimension B, the proxy problem. If the data is magical and you can't get it, the proxy becomes your reality.
It becomes the truth. We saw staff using all kinds of observable characteristics as stand-ins for academic data.
Like what?
The neighborhood a student lived in, the bus route they rode, and sometimes things that were, frankly, shocking. Vague, discriminatory things like last names that sounded minority.
Wait, really?
Or even, and this is a real one, the quality of their mother's handbag.
A mother's handbag. How could that possibly seem logical to a professional? What was the mental jump there?
Well, the logic in their mind went like this. High-income students are usually high-performing students. A high-quality handbag signals a high income. Therefore, a student whose mother doesn't have one must be at risk.
The proxy became more real than the actual data.
It was more accessible. That's state 4 logic in Dimension B.
Let's throw in Dimension C, cause and effect.
Yeah.
The old funding model loved the word innovative.
Oh, it was the magic word. There was no required link between what you did and the outcome you got. So if your program got funded, again, for doing some random activity, like teaching kids to make YouTube videos for dropout prevention.
You just assume the activity must be right because you got the money.
Exactly. You couldn't grasp the idea of rigorously proving a link to student outcomes.
And finally, let's touch on Dimension G, the skills required.
This one is just a profound misunderstanding. The general assumption, state 2, was that data analysis it's admin work. It's low skill. You give it to the least qualified person in the office.
When in reality, it's like flying a plane.
It's state 1, it's complex, it's specialized. But because they saw it as secretarial work, the skills needed for real accountability were never hired, never prioritized, never taught.
So you're telling me that every single one of these unbelievable stories we're about to hear makes perfect sense once you understand the flawed beliefs they were operating under.
That is exactly right. And let's start with maybe the most visual example of Dimension I, the belief that computers are magic. We called this one the laminated scroll.
Okay, set this up for us.
We needed a school system to track which students were in which literacy programs. They had a bunch of different programs, all with paper records. So we gave them a simple Excel file, 1 row per student, a column for each program.
And all they had to do was put an X in the right box. Simple.
Simple digital data entry. A week later, they call and say it's done, but we have to come pick it up in person.
Oh.
So we get there. They had printed every single page of the Excel file. They had taped them all together, dozens of pages, into one giant paper matrix.
No.
Yes. They laid it out on the floor, used a yardstick to keep their place, and marked all the X's with a pen. And then they fed the entire thing through a map-sized laminator.
A non-editable physical data wall. They literally turned a digital tool into a monument of analog labor.
And they were so proud. They were ecstatic. They told us they'd never been able to see the big picture before.
They didn't know about scroll bars.
They didn't know about school bars. They didn't know you could freeze panes. I couldn't even imagine that the file was supposed to be filled out on a computer.
That's Dimension I, State 3, in physical form. And you had to take this giant laminated thing back to your office.
And have interns key all the data back into a spreadsheet.
That is just incredible. Okay, let's move to a story that combines that proxy problem, Dimension B, with faulty cause and effect. The glamour shots.
This was a high school grant. The goal was to help students who had failed math before pass their current algebra class.
So a clear target population.
You would think. The program director didn't pull a list of struggling algebra students. He used his judgment. He enrolled students whose last names, in his opinion, sounded minority.
He used names as a proxy for academic need, bypassing the data entirely.
Precisely. His logic was that minority students are statistically at higher risk of failing math. He was confident in his proxy, but then it gets better.
Better.
He used a large chunk of the grant money to take the girls in the program to get their photos taken at glamour shots.
I have to stop you. Federal grant money for academic support was used for professional photo sessions. How on earth was that justified?
He wrote it down in a formal report to us. He said the photos would boost their confidence, and confident people pass math more often than people with low confidence.
Wow.
So the chain of reasoning, in his mind, was perfect. Demographic assumption leads to proxy selection, which justifies this innovative feel-good service that has zero demonstrated link to passing algebra.
The belief that because it felt right, it must be effective.
A perfect storm of flawed assumptions. And look, this wasn't just happening in schools, it went all the way up.
To the state level.
The box of proposals. A state education agency had distributed tens of millions in dropout prevention grants. When accountability finally became a thing, they realized they didn't have a reliable list of who got the money.
What did they do?
They literally handed us a giant cardboard box full of the paper proposals.
A box.
A box. They had hired temps to type the names into Excel, but reflecting Dimension G, no one knew how to use a spreadsheet. They had merged headers, no sorting. It was a mess.
So what did they expect you to do?
Well, when we said we needed outcome data to write the evaluation, they looked at us completely bewildered and asked, "We thought you wrote evaluation reports. Why can't you write one?"
They saw evaluation as a document you just produce, not a process based on data.
The evaluation was already known in their minds, and that magical thinking went right back down to the grantees. We had this one district, we called them the Magic Logic Model District.
Right.
They needed to fill out an online form to generate their program model. We had an instructional video explaining how.
And they called you? Upset?
Yes, saying they hadn't received their model. Turns out they had watched the instructional video over and over. They even printed out screenshots of each frame to prove they'd watched it.
They thought watching the video was the same as doing the work.
They thought it was a submission. They were waiting for the logic model to be mailed to them. And when we pressed, the director just said, "We don't know how you do anything that you do. It all seems like magic to us."
That is the deepest expression of dimension I've ever heard. If you can't imagine how the technology works, you just do the rituals you understand and wait for the magician.
And that disconnect goes even deeper, down to fundamental math. We called it the percent problem. Later on, these assessments showed that more than a third of professional educators only had, and this is a quote, a feel for what percent and average meant.
A feel for it.
We had fundamentally misunderstood what basic quantitative literacy meant in the sector.
Which brings us to the story of the $175,000 student.
It was a small district. They had 33 target students, kids who had failed algebra. They had a grant for $175,000 to help them.
Sounds great.
And they proudly reported their goal was for 3% of those students to pass.
Okay.
We had to point out to them that 3% of 33 is one, exactly one student.
They were planning to spend $175,000 to help one kid pass algebra.
They were just following an abstract rule. They insisted their data department told them that objectives are usually 3%. The rule was more real to them than the actual math.
And then there's the truly frightening one, the decimal story.
The one about school safety, yes. A staff member responsible for the data reports in writing that 47% of elementary school students had been suspended for dangerous weapons.
47%.
I called him immediately. I mean, that would shut down the entire state.
So what was the real number?
0.047%.
Oh my God.
And his explanation, calm as anything, was, "I never know where to put the decimal in a percent, so I just left it out."
He just left it out.
Yeah.
And that one simple error could have created a massive statewide panic.
And he had been working with that data for years. No one had ever caught that fundamental gap.
Let's do one more. The disconnect between the physical act and the digital result, the hand-keyed data.
We asked for a report on student suspensions from a district. My statistician requested the exact same report a month later. The numbers were totally different.
So was she manipulating the data?
No, not at all. She was hand-keying suspension data from paper forms, and she was always behind. When she ran the first report, she just hadn't finished typing them all in yet.
And a month later, she'd entered more.
Right, but crucially, she didn't understand there was a direct relationship between what she typed and what the magic software reported. She thought just entering the date range was enough to make the computer generate the true figures.
Believing the computer just conjures the report from the date, not from the data that's actually been entered.
Exactly. I mean, all these behaviors, the scroll, the glamour shots, the decimal error, they seem astonishing, but they are completely logical if you start from their assumptions.
The tragedy is that the assumptions were wrong. The data could be known, the list could be run. The software wasn't magic.
It wasn't.
And we still see these patterns today, don't we? I mean, the only big forced change in tech adoption we've seen recently was
COVID, the mandatory use of platforms like Zoom. But the systemic skills gap, the one rooted in these flawed mental models, it's still deeply entrenched. We realized we couldn't just give people software. We had to change what they fundamentally believed about knowledge and evidence.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? Think about the essential institutions you deal with every day. What seemingly small data flaw, what unquestioned assumption might be driving massive decisions? If these gaps can exist in a sector that manages the future of 50 million children, you have to wonder where else this data paralysis is hiding in plain sight.
Next time, we're going to move into the solution space, which, it turned out, brought its own set of shocking revelations. We started doing data academies to work directly with educators to fix this, and what we found went even deeper than we expected.
Join us for that, as we explore the ethical crisis that happens when educators finally see their own data, the emotional impact when their long-held beliefs collide with the evidence. We'll tell you about secret mentoring based on bus routes, and the story of a principal who systematically used data to filter minority students out of advanced classes.